From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien will comment on the impact of that new U.S. Japan trade deal on the grain trades. And he'll talk about this coming Monday's USDA grain stocks report during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also in today, K-State's Dallas Peterson going over the herbicide options for controlling two notorious broadleaf crop weeds here in the fall, field bindweed and burr ragweed. Dallas explaining why a fall treatment is generally the most effective approach against those two undesirables. And further ahead on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp joins us. All that and more coming your way next on this Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is the Friday edition of Agriculture Today. Welcome once more, and into the grain market scene we go now, and the comments coming your way from grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension. Dan's along with us, as usual, from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Number of things we'll take up here, Dan, but let's begin with, at last, what was a favorable development for the agricultural sector in general this week, in that trade agreement between the United States and Japan was formally announced and finalized, with some details still to fall into place there. But this was roundly regarded as a positive thing for agriculture, which would include, of course, the grain trades.
Yes, and if you remember when this administration came into office, they backed away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Mm-hmm. Of course, the main players in that Trans-Pacific Partnership, the biggest one other than the U.S., if we just stayed in it, Japan, of course, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea, all in there as well, and a bunch of other countries. But the U.S. administration had indicated that they felt more comfortable going with bilateral country-to-country agreements. So this is a big thing, and Kansas wheat, the U.S. wheat in particular, are anxious to see the Japanese and U.S. work together on trade agreements just for the sake of avoiding the penalties that would have happened for the price of U.S. wheat that we'd have been receiving. That was, reports of 30 to 50 cents a bushel of penalty by not being in the TPP. Well, now here they have this. That's a positive. We also hear news, of course, with the agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that waits to be ratified. It sounds like it probably will pass, but other domestic political concerns are, on front burner with that right now. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that won't take that long for that to go through. Also, side discussions, not at the same level of full trade agreements, but understandings with Taiwan, South Korea, countries like that. So all for the good in terms of potential U.S. trade. And with that type of momentum, you do see probably as promising a set of conditions coming in to play as the U.S. and China are again at the bargaining table or coming there shortly. China has been proactively buying soybeans in the last bit of time. And so all for the good. And, of course, prospects for purchase of U.S. meats coming into China, they're at need, really, given the impact of the African swine fever and that's had on their swine herds. So a lot going on, but none of it really yet coming to fruition in terms of export purchases. We're really pretty slow when you look at the latest numbers that we've had coming through September 19th. However, especially on the soybean side, a lot of purchases will probably show up in the next 1 or 2 weeks because, again, the USDA numbers kind of trail. So it's hard to say that, gosh, things have gone gangbusters, that the field has changed because of these. Again, as you look at D's corn, on yesterday's close at 372 and a half, and November beans at 888 and a half, and even hard red winter wheat, the D's contract at 408 and a quarter. Again, no signs of lots of upside volatility, at least yet.
Dan, there is upcoming on Monday a USDA grain stocks report, and there's something of a sense that the grain trades might be taking a shade extra notice of what these latest stocks numbers would have to say.
The September 1 report, again, we'll be seeing the numbers on September 30th, but the September 1 report will basically be a precursor to the upcoming October WASDE and crop production report, particularly the WASDE number for the supply-demand side. Basically, when it says that, you had ending stocks as of the end of August, well, on September 1, those are the beginning stocks that we have for this coming into this marketing year. And, of course, in stocks reports, we generally know most of the inputs that are being considered in terms of, for corn, we know corn processing and ethanol plants, wet corn milling, we know exports pretty well, but we don't know livestock feeding very well. So this will give really the best number we have here in the U.S. for that feed and residual figure. And so that'll be important for corn, for grain sorghum. It'll be important for wheat. Again, when you look at the price ratios down southwest Kansas, cash price ratios between wheat and corn, you've got on yesterday's reported markets through the Ag Marketing Service, a $3.53 cash price for wheat in Garden City and a $3.68 cash price for corn, and 96% ratio. The ratio is basically unchanged from a week earlier, and the prices are about the same too. Point is that it's cheaper to feed the wheat than it is corn in that cash market. Of course, a lot depends on how rations are put together and how cattlemen, livestock feeders, again, how they design their rations, what their cattle are used to, and what's most efficient for them. That said, the economics are lining up that we should see some wheat feeding. So that's certainly out there, and there also will be a September small grains summary report, and for that we look at the size of the wheat crop. We have a lot of questions about what will be happening on the spring wheat harvest. And they've had moisture, excessive amounts of moisture, that has delayed the harvest of about the last 20 or 20+% of the hard red spring wheat crop up in North Dakota, Montana, those areas. And it has had such an effect on the quality of what's left standing in the field that groups such as U.S. Grains Council, that take in survey data from that, and other independent surveying groups, I've seen an announcement that they're not even going to go out and survey the quality of the last 20%. So that's a pretty big deal. But yet, in this summary report that USDA is putting out, they just have one number for spring wheat that'll include, all the production. But yet, there are quality differences between the first part, the first 70+% and that last 20-30%. So, I'm not quite sure how that'll affect us in our part of the world, but for hard red winter wheat. But one thing that probably is going to affect us is that. We're just getting going on corn harvest. Basically, at the end of September, October is when we would normally be seeding wheat, and it seems that we've seen this play out year after year, the last several years, Eric. That by the time we can finally get in to harvesting late developing corn crops, it competes directly for field time, the hours in the day, with what they would need to be doing if they're going to put the wheat in. So it looks like that situation's coming up again this year.
Dan, speaking of crop conditions, and we will talk more about this with Mary Knapp later on in the broadcast in some detail, but impending colder weather moving in from the north very soon now, and that's going to likely serve to slow the crops as they try to top off that maturity, and this could be that weather factor that triggers something.
Yes. If you just look at the 3 I states for corn and for soybean maturity and where they're normally at, where they've been at in terms of, for corn, for the amount of corn dented during the 2014-18 time period. You look at Illinois, we're normally at 97, Indiana, 93%, Iowa, 95%, and Kansas, normally 96. But this year, those three I states, Illinois is at 77, Indiana 73, Iowa 82, so 15, 20% late. Now, Kansas, our numbers are just trailing by about 3%. When you look even to the north of that, you've got Michigan at 82% normally dented, and they're at 53 by the last survey. Minnesota, normally 95 at 75. North Dakota, normally 89, 91%. North Dakota, Ohio, now they're at 59, 58. You look at that and have to wonder about how we'll finish up this year, going through these last reports on the size of the U.S. crop. And again, late harvesting issues, all of that coming into play. It would sure seem that the USDA's latest projection of 13.8 billion bushels it'll be challenging to get to that, frankly, just because, again, that number was come up with in the September report, assuming normal weather to the end. They weren't counting on this cold weather to get there. Percent of soybeans dropping leaves, again, those three I states, Illinois 56% is normal, 64 Indiana, and 54 in Iowa. This year, Illinois is at 14%. Leaves dropped as of September 22nd. Indiana 26, Iowa 22, and we'll have to wrestle with maturity issues in both corn and soybeans. Here in Kansas, hopefully things moved along, and our grain sorghum is in decent shape, and we do have numbers on that. In terms of percent mature, normally we're at 34% by, about September 22nd. This year we're at 21. Really not as far behind as our fellow farmers in the Eastern Corn Belt on corn.
Well, the question then becomes, will reality set in the form of an according market response to that then? Well,
I guess the best way to answer that is we'll eventually have credible, trustworthy numbers with the crops in the bin. And if you're a trader and if you think that the markets might be going up or going down more than where they're at, there's a whole host of other people that are just willing to take advantage of your potential misstep.
Right.
So they're going to wait until they have some verification, and that just sets us up for some real volatility that could happen in October, November when these USDA reports come out.
Dan, many thanks.
Take care, Eric. Thank you.
He is grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today returns shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in one serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today returns now here on the K-State Radio Network. Well, crop producers, we have another weed management consideration or two for you right here as we drift into the fall season now. And along with us once more is weed management specialist Dallas Peterson of K-State Research and Extension. The weed species we want to dwell upon today, Dallas, both are best controlled with fall herbicide applications, we're going to find as we discuss these. Before we go any further, let's talk about the nature of these in tandem, burr ragweed and field bindweed. They're common in Kansas, and especially the one which is statewide.
Right. There are a lot of similarities, but some differences between the two species. The similarities would be that they're both deep-rooted perennial broadleaf weeds. They tend to, again, form colonies, if you will, because they can reproduce vegetatively by that spreading root system. And they're very difficult to control because of that reason. And even some of the herbicides that we use are very similar to control them. But even that being said, again, very difficult to control with anything. But fall is a good time to treat them, and persistence is going to be very important to manage them through time.
Now, we see field bindweed virtually anywhere in the state. Burr ragweed, more of a western Kansas issue?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And some people might be surprised to find out that, field bindweed is not native to North America. And that's really true with a lot of our most troublesome weeds. They were introduced from other parts of the world. And so it's native to Eurasia, but clearly it's very well adapted to Kansas because, as you indicated, it does occur throughout. And it's a very common weed. It's not everywhere, obviously, but it is very common throughout the state. Whereas the woolly leaf burr sage, also known as burr ragweed, it is actually native to western Kansas and does very well there, but we don't see it at all, hardly, in eastern Kansas, which may seem a little bit odd. It also seems to grow best in the low-lying areas that may hold water parts of the year in western Kansas. And so that would raise the question, why isn't it common in eastern Kansas? And I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think it's maybe tolerant, to the high salt soils where that water does tend to accumulate in western Kansas. But for whatever reason, it's very persistent there. But again, just clearly not present even in the eastern part of the state.
And what have we found over the years about the cost to the producer in terms of hurting yields?
Oh, yeah, both of them extremely competitive where they do occur. Now, as I indicated, they tend to be kind of in spots, and we might attack them that way from a management standpoint as well. One of the things that has really helped, especially with bindweed through the years, is the shift to no-till. Because when we were tilling the soil, when we run through those spots and we would drag maybe root segments from one part of the field to the other, they could just regenerate new plants. And so, again, particularly with field bindweed, in some cases the spot was the whole field. And that's a bad situation because, again, they can be very competitive with the crops, especially if they're out there and established before we get the crop established. Now, if you have a good competitive crop up and growing before they really get going, i.e. wheat in some cases, that crop can be pretty competitive with it if it gets a head start. Because I'd say they're not real competitive for light if, you have a canopy out there. But they certainly are very competitive for water. And so, again, it gets a little bit dry. They can almost completely eliminate yield in those spots.
All right. Well, the endorsement here is for treating either or both of these here in the fall. That has to do with root uptake more than anything else?
Well, not necessarily root uptake, but rather movement to the roots.
Right.
So, again, if they are actively growing, and they oftentimes are in the fall, if we've got adequate moisture. So this year, across much of the state, would seem to be an ideal year maybe to make those treatments. When we apply that herbicide, we get more of it moving down into the root. And really with perennial weeds, typically we have two best times to treat them with a herbicide to get that movement down into the roots. One is when they're first kind of starting to bloom, okay? We've kind of depleted that root reserve, and they start to move stuff back down into the roots at that point in time. And the other is in the fall when they're maybe kind of preparing for the winter season, if you will. We're moving more carbohydrates down to the roots, and so herbicide application at that point in time also will get carried maybe more thoroughly down into the roots. So fall is one of the best times, and especially with certain herbicides, to try to get good control of both of these species.
But only if you apply before killing frost, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and we never know when that's going to happen for sure. Now, both of them can tolerate light frost. And so oftentimes it has to get down into the low 20s, get a good hard freeze really before that occurs. And we've oftentimes said with bindweed, actually, you may get your best control after a light frost, but before a killing freeze. Now, again, we can't predict that. And, we're going to have to do it a few days before that killing freeze to kind of get that ideal scenario for that movement down into the roots.
Yeah. All right, then, Dallas, to the herbicide alternatives, again, based on K-State field trials over many years testing these products out. Do we need a different suite of herbicides for either of these, or can we cross over and control both with particular products?
Well, for the most part, we use many of the same herbicides to control both of them, with one major exception. And so a lot of these herbicides are not new. They're old herbicides. Probably the most effective on both weeds from a long-term standpoint is Tordon-type products. Now, Tordon kind of has a reputation for being pretty potent, and so, again, you have to be careful when and how you use that and what the subsequent crop is and all of that sort of thing. But Tordon is fairly persistent. It lasts in an environment for a while. It is systemic, so it will move in the roots. And so fall applications of Tordon have probably given us some of the best residual control of both of these species. When we're in kind of between crops, and depending upon what crop we're going to plant afterwards.
Because of waiting intervals required.
Yes, and especially broadleaf crops are very susceptible to residues of Tordon. So, between wheat crops maybe is one of the best, or, when we're wheat, maybe going to sorghum, that sort of thing. So you have to be very cognizant of the rotational restrictions with Tordon, and therefore, again, spot treatments sometimes are maybe the best approach to take with those Tordon applications. Also, in addition to that, good old 2,4-D and dicamba, again, systemic herbicides, a good broadleaf activity. Those are probably two of our other common treatments that we might be using for both of them. Glyphosate isn't necessarily great, but it does have activity. And again, in no-till, we oftentimes are using that on a regular basis. And so it's a matter of, again, just kind of keep beating it down through time. And we're oftentimes going to include glyphosate as a part of our program in no-till, especially for control of other species as well. So that can be a part of that program, if you will, through time. The other herbicide that can be pretty darn effective for bindweed, but not so much for the burr ragweed, is one called quinclorac. Now, it's been known by a couple of different names. In the early years, it was known as Paramount. But more recently, they've kind of changed that name on us. And so now it's known as Facet. Facet is, I'd say, probably pretty comparable to Tordon for control. And so, again, it's probably one of our best ones for the bindweed control. And it has worked well as a fall treatment. Now, the advantage of the Facet, the rotational restrictions aren't as severe. It still has some of those, but we can apply it right up to planting wheat, for example, or we can rotate to sorghum without any issues the following year. So again, Paramount probably equally effective, but fewer long-term rotational restrictions also, even to the broadleaf crops in later years. It's been fairly expensive, and so that's kind of been one of the limitations. So again, spot treatment oftentimes is maybe the best route to go with that. But Facet, very good alternative, if you will, to Tordon for the bindweed control, but not very good on the burr ragweed or woolly leaf burr sage control.
You can reference the chemical weed control guide from K-State for more details on all of these options. Is there anything to be gained by tank mixes here, Dallas?
Yes and no. I would say, again, either the Facet or the Tordon is still going to be by far the most effective, but adding the dicamba or 2,4-D or, again, throughout the season, glyphosate also will help. But really, those two are probably going to be the best. Although I would say dicamba as a fall treatment also can be maybe just a step below those. The 2,4-D and the glyphosate, even though they'll provide some suppression, they're not going to provide nearly as good a long-term suppression of those two weeds.
Very well. Crop producers, study your choices for controlling these perennial weeds, burr ragweed and field bindweed in your cropping areas via that Chemical Weed Control for Field Crops guide from K-State. You can acquire that online or through your local extension office. Dallas, we appreciate the update.
All right, my pleasure.
Weed Management Specialist Dallas Peterson of K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Closing out this Agriculture Today, it's our weekly segment on Kansas agricultural weather as we catch up again with climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. Mary, as we speak, happens to be in transit. She's returning from a few days at an event at the Climate Prediction Center just outside of Washington, D.C. Mary, before we go any further on the weather outlook, what was happening at that particular gathering?
At that gathering, basically what we're getting was an update on the products that the Climate Prediction Center produces, which include, of course, the weekly and monthly and seasonal outlooks that we utilize regularly when we're looking at what might be happening down the road in Kansas. And some of the things that they were talking about were improvements in how they are processing the data, how they are generating the forecast. And that's all good news for us because the better that outlook can be, the better and more useful it will be in Kansas.
By way of example, what sorts of ideas are they churning on right now? What are the possibilities there?
Well, one thing that they're looking at is a better understanding of the teleconnections. We talk about the El Nino or La Nina a lot, but they're also looking at things like the Madden-Julian Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and how those might influence the flavor of an ENSO event. Another thing that they're looking at is improvements in integrating all of the data that's available so that they can do finer scale precipitation forecasts, which again are very useful to producers.
It's an exciting field and always interesting to hear what's on the horizon in the way of climate predictions. So eagerly awaiting those advances. The week in review for Kansas, well, we've cooled off certainly from the late summer heat and rainfall here and there once again, Mary.
Right, and we should note that we did see some expansion on the U.S. Drought Monitor. That cutoff period for that report is Tuesday, so it didn't capture the rainfall that reached central and south central Kansas Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. Some places had flood warnings out, particularly in the Pratt area, and you're going, well, yeah, put a little bit more drought on the map and let's see if we can make it rain. But again, the rainfall tended to be highly variable, so not everyone got it. It's a little bit more urgently needed in the west where they've missed out on most of the September rains and their soils are drying out quite a bit. We're getting into the winter wheat planting season, and we would like to have a very balanced rainfall. We don't want a repeat of what we saw last year where we were dry and then the rain started and didn't turn off, making it difficult to complete harvest or get anything in the ground for fall planting. At this point, we are looking at a significant rain event, not only this weekend, but as we approach the 8 to 14-day period of next Friday, there may be a second round coming through.
But the question is, will those rounds actually extend into western Kansas to help chip away at that ever-widening droughty area?
Well, at this point, the quantitative precip forecast has it pushing out to all but the westernmost stretches of the state, and they're looking at getting between a quarter and a half an inch of rain in that area, which is fairly significant for this time of the year for them. The problem is going to be more in the central and the eastern part of the state because it looks like it's going to be a very heavy rain event with that, and some places in the northeast may see as much as 7 inches of rain out of that, which in those areas we're already dealing with saturated soils. We don't need a rain event of that nature.
Not at all. And there is the potential for severe weather in some parts of central and eastern Kansas, too. So heads up on that.
Right. There is a very strong boundary layer between the cooler air that's coming in and the warm, moist air that's behind it. And that, again, can fuel some severe weather. It looks like at this point, high winds and hail will be the biggest danger. But, again, that's not what we need at this time of the year.
And we are, of course, regularly tracking what's happening with our temperatures and the influences on crop maturity and dry down. These crops are now in a period where they really need some warm weather, and whether that's forthcoming is still in the balance.
Right. We are looking at closer to normal temperatures in the short term, the 6 to 10 day, but as you move out to the 8 to 14 day, there's an increased chance for cooler than normal temperatures. One of the problems that they're facing is that it looks like those low temperatures may stay on the elevated level. At this time of the year in eastern Kansas, we're expecting nightly lows in the mid-50s. If we stay in the mid-60s, we're going to be warmer than normal, but it won't necessarily contribute a lot to that dry down. Those warmer nighttime temperatures are indicative of a higher dew point, higher humidities, and that complicates the dry down pattern.
And have to ask, because there's a great deal of chatter about it now, there is a cold wave expected to move into the northern plains here in the not-too-distant future. The question here in Kansas, will that freeze dip down as far south as this state?
At this point, it does not look like that is likely. Again, we've got quite warm nighttime lows still going in place. You looked this morning and we were seeing lows in the 60s in western Kansas. Again, that's likely to moderate as it moves through Nebraska and into Kansas. There is a slight chance in that northwest corner, but again, we're moving close to their average annual freeze date anyway. The unfortunate problem is that even an average freeze date may be too soon for some of these late planted crops.
And that's looking at 7 or 8 days down the road, so that's not imminent.
Right. No, it doesn't look like there is any likelihood with this current wave coming through, and it may be another 10 days before we start seeing cooler temperatures in Kansas.
All right. We'll keep an eye on things, and we wish you all the best in your travels back to Manhattan later today. Mary, thanks for checking in with us.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, along with us each Friday right here. And our thanks to you for listening in. We'll welcome you right back here this same time on Monday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.